Welcome to today's episode of the Rule Breakers podcast. I'm your host, Sean McGrath, and with me today, I'm delighted to say, is Mr. Peter Flynn from the great capital city of Ireland called Cork.
Thank you very much.
Peter has had a very long and varied career in the world of touching all aspects of electronic publishing, has a particular interest and an expertise in markup languages and in typesetting systems, in particular LaTeX and tech. So it's great to have you and have this opportunity to chat for a little bit, Peter.
Yeah, it's good to be here. Thank you.
Great. So can we start by going on a trip down memory lane?
Yeah.
You've always struck me as being someone who sort of straddles the world of with a keen interest in typography and typesetting, but also a keen interest in markup languages, generalized markup languages. I know you were involved in the early days of HTML. I believe you had the first ever website in Ireland.
Yeah.
So could you tell us a little bit about that whole journey and how you ended up getting into that?
Yeah. I mean, the whole thing started when I was in school, and I was in the art room, and I discovered a big box full of little pieces of metal. And each one of them had a letter in reverse on the end of it. So I deduced that they were pieces of type. And I asked if I could be allowed to play with them. And I was presented with an Adana flatbed press and a little box of equipment. And so with the help of a local printer, I got it back into working order and started printing mostly scurrilous material, for which I got reprimanded. For that was my first brush with authority and the press. But it did teach me the rudiments of composition and the length of time that it took to actually put together a page and then print it up. But after a brief hiccup in attempting to do a degree in languages, I ended up at the London College of Printing, doing actual printing, although it was an H&D in management. But as a part of that, I got exposed to doing real composition on real equipment in a factory-like setting. But amongst the things that I came across was a concept known as computer typesetting, for which they had an early piece of equipment. And I thought that was actually very clever because it was, first of all, clean. You didn't get covered.
No ink.
No ink. And you didn't get lead on your fingers. That was not entirely made, but... and it seemed to offer a degree of flexibility that was absent, but also a degree of uncontrollability. One of the benefits of using metal type in a frame is that you are restricted physically by the right-angled box nature of putting letters together in a line and putting lines together into a paragraph and putting paragraphs together into a page, which people have never really railed against it, but it has become a kind of restriction that people accept and that they know this is how it works because it's been working happily for 550 years or whatever. So people are satisfied with it. So then when I left there and I meandered into print training, but the organization I was with, one of the industrial training units in London, had a computer, which they used for admin. And because I had had some exposure to computers, I got roped into helping run it. And so that too was interesting. And it showed me how little management understand about computers. And then when that all got wound up and we were all put out on the streets, I ended up getting a job with an actual computer company dealing with actual computing. And of course, at this time, the Big Bang was coming in London. And everybody was buzzing around saying how wonderful it's going to be when all the stock exchange is computerized and you don't have anybody bidding on a floor anymore. And at that point, I thought, no, that's probably not a great idea. And the company was looking to move away. So I decided to part company with the company. And I ended up in academia. I ended up in UCC and doing technical support for electronic publishing. And that seemed to be a thing where I could usefully make some use of my skills to help other people, particularly academics, deal with the problems of publishers, which are many, are varied. And the problems, of course, I was wearing two hats because I'd come from the printing and the publishing industry. Authors were a kind of annoyance that you had to put up, and they had to be there to write the stuff. But by God, you had to deal with some very, very strange understandings or misunderstandings of what was involved.
Right.
Right up to the very well-known authors, and there are plenty of cases of well-known authors who, of course, can pretty much do what they say, and the publisher says, "Yes, of course, Mr. Joyce. Yes, of course, you can do that," and not have any pushback. Whereas with the impending author from an academic background, who is terrified by the entire process, has probably only ever used a word processor before, has absolutely no idea about pagination or imposition or any of the complexities of putting it together, ended up knocking on my door screaming for help.
Right. Was this help with tech in particular? Was this?
No, in general, it was general help. I had started using tech. Actually, I had started using tech when I was still in London. And a colleague of mine had been to California and had met some of the people. I don't think he met Cloth, but I think he met people involved with this. And he came back with a tape called EDP8, I think. And so we compiled it, and it worked. I thought, oh my God, this is unbelievable. What's more, this is not something that you have to pay 50 grand for. It's written in Pascal, and it runs on any ordinary business computer. That was mind blowing, and so I'd seen what it could do, but then I did nothing with it for a while because it clearly wasn't in a state that you could start using it for general purpose jobbing.
I remember PDP-11. They had a PDP-11 in Trinity. That was a Digital Equipment Corporation computer, wasn't it? So I don't remember the PDP-8. So one of those was on campus in UCC, was it?
No, this was in the company in London.
Oh, I see. Company.
They had a modified version of a PDP-8.
I've always found it amusing, well, interesting, that the entire history of Unix in all of its many variants is wrapped, if my understanding of history is correct, is wrapped around the history of typesetting. In that, I believe that's part of what the folks were asked to do in Murray Hill, New Jersey, in the AT&T research labs. Was they needed a typesetting system. I think TROF was eventually the one that they created.
Yep.
But they on the way they created the C programming language and the Unix operating system as a way of basically meeting the management requirement to produce a typesetting system.
Yeah, and all the utilities that go with it that we're accustomed to nowadays, but also things like make index, which nowadays is mostly used for indexing text stuff, but with actually index, any you give it any IDX file, it'll do the job for you. And so there's an enormous amount of stuff that was written to be generic. It would plug into almost anything you had, just a little tweak here and there. It was a very, very far-sighted way of doing this.
Had you been using? I can't remember again the chronology here. There's the tech system from Newth, it was Stanford, wasn't it? Does that system predate the TROF typesetting system?
No, I don't think so. I think I should know this. It's all in the thesis. No, TROC came first, or at least at similar time. And then Knuth wrote the original version of tech, I think, was written in SAIL, Stanford Artificial Intelligence Language.
Okay.
But I presume he got disillusioned with that and rewrote it in his own language for the web, which is a Pascal-like thing. But the advantage of web is that you can run one program which produces Pascal source code from the web file, and another program which produces text source code for making documentation.
The tangle and weave thing, was it? I remember.
That's
got
correct,
it. Got it. Yeah.
So you write a snippet of code, and then you write the documentation.
Right, in line.
And then you write the next snippet of code and the next bit of documentation.
Yeah.
And so at the end, you run whichever one it is, Tangle, and generate Pascal, and run the other one and generate text source, and then compile the Pascal, run tech on the source code, and out pops your DVI documentation. I mean,
That whole paradigm was like so far ahead of its time. I mean, all of
it was way ahead.
it's like docs as code. I think they call it today.
Well,
But
there are several implementations of the concept, but I mean, he produced one that just worked straight out of the box. You write and run the programs, and that's it. And all you can run in generic code on pretty much any kind of Oculus computer that you care to name. No PCs, obviously, at that stage. And that worked well. And so certainly when I got to UCC, there were one or two people using in tech. But most of the stuff that I was dealing with was word processors.
Right.
And WordPerfect, of course, was ruled supreme at that stage. WordPerfect didn't say anything about a company you've never heard of called Microsoft. But in general, one word processor is much like another, and they do have this inbuilt concept of don't let the user see what's going on.
Right.
Don't hide everything. Just show them the formatted result, and it doesn't matter what's right or wrong with it, so long as it looks pretty.
Right.
And WordPerfect broke the mold to some extent in that it did have this line at the bottom of the screen which told you whereabouts in the document you were, because it knew what a chapter was, and it knew what a section was, and it knew what a paragraph was, it knew what a table was.
Right.
And kind of a trace, a running visual display of where you were in the document. And certain people who converted WordPerfect files to typesetting files used this extensively because it was the only thing they could trust to tell them whereabouts in the document they were. And there was a program used by typesetters for journals, and I'm furiously struggling to remember its name now. But I can't. I can go and look it up. Which converted WordPerfect files to a form of HTML. And the typesetters who were required to produce HTML as part of their contract loved it because it exposed what was in the file in a plain text form that they could dig into and find out what was in there and put right what was wrong.
Right.
But then when XML came along, it was never updated, so it died, which was a shame. But I had people from a lot of typesetting companies around the Shannon area who were doing journal typesetting, who were using this program, and they come across SQL, but they didn't really understand what the pointer bracket did.
Right.
And so that was where I had started to get interest in markup. But we had a bunch of chemists in UCC who were on an EU-funded or EC-funded project, as it then was. And all the documentation for their project had to be in HTML. So there they were, struggling with the plain text editor to type in all the pointy brackets and get it all looking right. But once they'd done that, they had no way of printing it. They had no way to format it. They didn't know what they were supposed to do with the thing. And by pure chance, I happened to be at a meeting in Berlin in the Deutsche Forschungsnetz. And talking to a colleague there, it turned out they had a program called Daphne, which would convert HTML to latex.
Okay.
I thought, this sounds incredibly useful. And so I persuaded them to give me a tape of it to bring back home. So I compiled that and put that back together, got the chemist's HTML, found out what was wrong with it by parsing it and inspection, put all the pointy brackets in the right place, ran it through, and lo and behold, it generated this latex file. So I then processed that and produced a PostScript file and printed it off and took it in. They sort of stood there with their jaws dropping to say, we had no idea you could do this. I said, well, nor did I, but it seems to work fine.
We're still in pre World Wide Web days at this point. This is before you. When did HTML cross your radar? When I distinctly remember the day when I first connected into this World Wide Web thing, and then did the equivalent of view source, and I think it was the Cello browser or something, and recognized. Oh, I recognize this. Obviously HTML markup under the hood. At what point did that come to your world?
I had that came in two threads. I had started working with TEI, which is the
Okay,
humanities
that's great.
SQL markup, because we had a project in UCC called Celt, which
Oh
was
yeah.
producing early Irish documents, all marked up in SQL, all according to the TEI. So it's compatible with every other humanities research project in the world.
Hmm.
Great. Sounds like a very good idea, and that worked very well. So I knew what pointy brackets were. That wasn't the problem. And then in an entirely separate thread, Ireland was getting its connection to the internet in the late 80s.
Hmm.
Previously, we'd had a connection to BitNet. So ourselves and UCD had a BitNet connection for several years before we got the full internet connection. There was a committee of the HEA Network Management Committee, which I was on. And each one of us was tasked with following up on various EU-funded threads.
Hmm.
And I ended up in a working group working for a bunch called RARE, the Réseau Associé de la Recherche Européenne, who had been contracted by DG13 of the EU to recommend what we, the community, should do about networking and documentation and
Hmm.
help and all these kinds of things. And I was the Irish representative on that. And the representative of CERN was Tim Berners-Lee.
Okay.
So I got to know Tim very well, and there was about 20 of us on the committee, and we would meet once or twice a year. We'd go through all the work that we've been doing all kinds of stuff during the gaps between the meetings. And we'd present a report and then finally present a report to the EU saying, well, look, we recommend it should go this way. The biggest struggle was that, of course, the standards people wanted everything to be X500. They wanted 500 directories. They wanted X400 email and file transfer and all the rest of it. Humongous protocols, massively complicated, hugely expensive because there was no open source equivalent. And there were a few people, including myself, who had been to the States and looked at this, led by Guy Hauser from Holland, who said, no, look, the Americans have produced this stuff called IP, Internet Protocol, and it's free. You download it, you run it, it just works like that out of the box. You don't have to do anything, it's just there. And slowly that gained traction. But there were a lot of people saying, oh no, we can't possibly have anything American. That's quite out. It has to be European developed standards. And the Eric House and the others said, well, no, nobody's going to adopt it. The UK did start adopting it in the Cuddleback protocols, and so did HEA to begin with. But then finally, people saw sense.
But I presume at this stage, you're back in the era now when the only entities on the island that had access to TCP/IP, that had access to the internet, were the academic institutions. I presume this predates the idea of what were they called? ISPs, internet service providers. I presume
pretty much. There was an ISP in Cork, and there were a couple in Dublin,
Hmm.
and there were, of course, large companies had their own connections because they could afford them and they had people who knew how to make them work. But then, having met Tim Berners-Lee on several occasions on these network meetings, he then said, oh, you know what I've been working on, guys? This way of getting all the scientists in CERN to read each other's reports. Instead of writing them in a word processor, I've knocked together this little pointy bracket thing called HTML, and I've written a server and a client so that they can upload their reports to the server, and anybody on the campus, and CERN is enormous, anybody on the campus can just run the client and can download or read their reports online. And look, it's got links in it too, so you can link from one report to the next. And then Tim demonstrated this stuff at a meeting, I think it was in Zurich. And we all looked at it, we said, oh my God, it works. So I came back very excited. I thought, right, let's have this. And so Tim had given us all the URL. We could download the source code from his machine in CERN. And I managed to get it. I cranked it. It was written for, he had a Next.
Right. The Steve Jobs.
But it was all written,
yeah.
it was all written in C. So it was very
Right.
straightforward to deal with. And I was using a new Sun workstation, which belonged to the Kelp project. And so I downloaded the server, and a little bit of to and fro with email managed to get that compiled and running. And so I put up Ireland's first web page, which was the Ashling Engusser, the Cream of Angus, from the Kelp project in a transcribed HTML version,
Right.
converted to HTML and available to the web. And so that's where it all started in Ireland.
At what point did the HTML working group itself form?
That was an IETF thing. That came along very shortly afterwards when I forget who. Somebody said, this is great, but we're going to need to standardize this. Otherwise, everybody will go off and invent their own crap.
Right.
And Tim said, well, yeah, it was never meant to be formal in the sense of HTML. He didn't intend that the files would be parsable according to the strict rules of HTML. He reckoned that it would be tokenizable, that it would be tolerant of errors. If you type 2 pointy brackets in a row, it wasn't going to get worried about them.
Right, right.
So it was very tolerant, and it did, of course, use SGML's minimization, which would leave off the closing tag on a paragraph,
right,
leave off the closing tag on a title, because if you type H1 for a title, and then type your title, and then on the next line you type open tag P, well, the title is automatically finished by the fact that you start the paragraph, so you don't even close. So there was a huge amount of minimization to make it faster and easier to write.
These were back in the days now where every byte counted, right? These are dial-up modem.
Yeah, at some point it became an IETF working group, and it attempted to standardize it. And there were a lot of arguments, and you were there as well, you Miller, how much there was about whether it should use SGML formally, whether there should be a parser built into the browser, and which the answer was no, because of the overhead. The processing overhead was the other thing, not just the file size. A lot of CPUs would have struggled to run something like SGMLS.
Right.
So then along came Mozilla and the graphical Mosaic, and then the graphical browsers. And then the idea that they could invent their own tags. So Blink was invented.
Blink, yeah. I remember the famous drama around the Blink tag. Yes,
yeah, there was a lot of drama around that, and I used some very rude words, which I refused to say. But at that point, it became obvious that there wasn't ever going to be a parsable form of SGML that would work inside a browser. Even though, I'm trying to remember, is it Panorama? The Panorama
Softquad, yeah.
Softquad. They had written an incredibly small and fast parser that was able, and we had it running on one of the TEI files. And of course, TEI is extremely big and complex, very much DTD, and an enormous number of tags, of which you can use pretty much anything anywhere. But they had written a parser which could deal with it, and a style sheet which could render it. So you could plug this Panorama plugin into your Netscape browser, head off to the Kelp website, and download the raw SGML.
Yeah.
So when it went twiddly, and in 2 seconds it had rendered it.
Yeah, hyperlinks as well, I remember. It did high time style.
It did high time, yes. You could have bi-directional hyperlinks between.
Yeah.
And that was running, that worked. And so that was developing. And then around 1994, I forget where it was, at one of the SGML conferences, and Michael Sperber, the queen of
recently deceased, unfortunately.
Late and much lamented Michael Sperber.
Indeed.
Collared me on an escalator in the hotel and said, we're thinking about doing something about web SGML. And from that developed the WTC's XML and a whole bunch of stuff, and finally managed to get that put through
Right.
the web SGML adaptations to.
Right. And how did you end up getting involved in the W3C?
I was never involved in the W3C directly because you have to be a big company and pay a large sum of money. But I was on the, what do they call it? The
A special interest group or something, wasn't it? The XMLC. Yeah, I was on the
So
same.
basically, we were tracking what they were doing in the meetings,
Yeah.
and sort of saying, "Yeah, that's a great idea, that'll run," or "No, that's bullshit. You'll never make that work in a million." And Tim Ray was kind of moderating this and saying, "Well, yeah,
Right.
don't go overboard, guys, or hold your horses." He had a very unenviable task there. It all worked out, and XML came out, and we threw away some things. And I still think we would have been better keeping off some of them. And, we adopted others, but by and large it works, and it's light,
Yeah.
and it's in itself it's simple. People have tried to make it complicated, but
Yeah. Yeah. True. Indeed. Indeed. I
then
remember James Clark back in the days was, because he was implementing stuff.
it took him, I think, a day and a half to add the minus WXML to NSGMLS.
And HTMLS. Right.
So
Right.
it would
Right.
then parse XML according to the spec.
Yeah.
You could do an amazing amount of stuff with it. And I remember at a conference, I think it was in Philadelphia, where I was presenting something like that. And I was saying, well, look, with these little tools, which are all free, and with the Unix text utilities like awk, you can take an XML file and turn it into, for example, a LaTeX file or a plain text file, simply by parsing it out or using what James called it, the mode of output for NSGMLS that outputs the attributes before the
It's ESIS.
ESIS. That's it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You can take the ESIS, and I wrote a parser for ESIS in awk
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
at LaTeX. And I was accosted after this training session by an extremely red-faced and irate gentleman from the Midwest of America who was outraged that it was possible to do this without just by downloading it and writing a few lines of code. It turned out that his company had just paid some high-fund consultancy something like 50 grand to write a program to do exactly this.
Oh dear.
And it still didn't work properly.
Right.
And how dare I come along with free software and do the same thing? He was very, very upset. And I can understand him being upset. On the other hand, if you don't pay attention to what's happening, you will get taken for a ride. And
Yeah.
there's no more true than nowadays.
Yeah. That was a huge epiphany for me when I realized that I could just, pipe you on Unix style, pipe the output from NSGMLS, get the ESIS output.
Yes.
And then use that as the input to, a pipeline, in order to do what back in the day, I guess we used to call multi-channel publishing. That idea that you could have a paper output, you could have a HTML output, you could have a CD-ROM output, all from a single source was kind of a major aha moment back in the day.
Well, yeah, you suddenly realize, oh my God, you don't have to maintain multiple versions. It took a long time for the publishing business to understand this because they had been working the other way around for decades. Well, they required their authors to produce a file, and they had grudgingly admitted that it would have to be a word processor file. And they would send that to a typesetter. And the typesetter would typeset the article in the style for the journal and send back film ready to make baits for. They were also contracted to produce SGML after the event.
Right.
So SGML was an afterthought and not something that you would want to do. And I spoke to several of these people and I said, well, the software is all available to let you produce the SGML first.
Right.
Then you can produce the film for which you can use VB2 or LaTeX or whatever you want to do the typeset. And you can then offer HTML as well. And they said, well, basically, no, that involves learning too many new skill sets.
Right.
Our people who are basically typesetters, they understand line breaking and they understand page arrangement, but they're not markup people.
Right.
What they did is they had, as I mentioned, this program that produced HTML from WordPerfect. But apart from that, they weren't terribly interested here. Academics, on the other hand, once they saw the web, and I was in the IT services in UCC, and of course, we had a constant stream of departments saying, "Oh, well, why have Department X got a web page and we haven't?" And the answer was,
Right.
you merely have to send me an email, and I'll give you a login, and you can create your own.
I mean, it's obviously, and then basically, the web absolutely took off. And XML obviously took off from HTML.
Yes.
CD-ROMs went the way of the dodo. There is still a tremendous amount of PDF in the world. A whole bunch of different tools that people use to create that stuff. But it seems to me that the longevity of PDF, there's a more profound reason, I think, as to why PDF is always going to be with us. There are those who say we'll get to the stage where we no longer will need PDF. Everything will be, the concept of a page is going to go away. I'm interested in your perspective. My 2 cents on it is that the nice things about PDF, especially PDF-A, is that it actually is the best possible digital representation of exactly what the author intended. And there are times, as you know, when layout actually matters to meaning, and PDF can capture that. So a lot of the work that we do in legislation and regulation and really important technical standards that drive things like aircraft, planes, trains, and automobiles, medical devices, it's kind of important that the stuff has a I suppose what in the modern era is called a ground truth that you can refer to, like a master version. So if there's a doubt between what the web page says and what the PDF says, then, kind of PDF wins. So be interested in your perspective on that. Have we reached the end of the road for PDF?
I think for the moment we're heading towards an end of the road. I'm sure that there will be a fork at some stage. I think publishers recognize the utility of this. I mean, as far back as the days of PostScript, because they could generate a fixed format that you couldn't fiddle with.
Right.
Well, yeah, you can actually fiddle with PostScript, but it's really, really hard.
Yeah.
When PDF came along, they rejoiced because it is even harder to meddle with PostScript. And so they could pretty much say, yeah, this is ours. This is last month's issue of the journal. It's now fixed. Even if you change your mind, we are not going to update it. And if you want to refer to it, it's there forever. And you can always come back to it and you will know that it is ours and that it was published on the 15th of March 2022, and that's it. And so they very much liked that idea. They have, to some extent, messed up the deal by not keeping the stuff online. And there's some publishers, of course, who pulled it up and gone to the wall, and all their stuff has been lost, which is pity. But in general, I think they were very happy about the idea of PDF. Their printers, of course, did need PDF X1A or something that would reliably give them something that their raster interface processors would turn into dots on a page. I remember one of the very first books that we did, remember, staff in UCC, we generated Well, that was PostScript. We generated PDF in very early days of PDF, sent it to the printer, who gave it to his plate maker, who fired up his rip and came back to us, 30 minutes later, having generated everything he wanted, and said, how did you create that file? And it went straight through, clean as a whistle, no error messages, not a problem, and everything has come out looking perfect. I said, where did you get it from? I said, well, it's a program called LaTeX.
Right, right.
He'd never heard of it, but it made the point that it confirmed to me that we were on the right path.
What intrigues me about tech is obviously it's gone through all of these different iterations, but like it has a very strong community behind it. In particular, in I guess academic journal land. How do you see that panning out? I mean, we talked about what's going to happen to PDF formats here in the future.
Yeah.
But I come across a lot of folks who've got academic backgrounds who are ninjas with LaTeX, and have to submit in LaTeX form to the journal publisher.
Mm-hmm.
But then there are other alternatives that I've seen, for example, that are based on using Adobe InDesign. And do you think that LaTeX is or tech in general, has a healthy future in academic publishing? Do you think that there's a chance it might get replaced by something else over time?
It could be. I mean, there is a very interesting project called the Future of Text, run by a guy called Frode Hegland, and he's written an editor for the Mac, which produces PDF, and the interface to it is really, really very impressive.
Right.
At the moment, it is Mac only, but
Right.
if you search for Future of Text, Frode Hegland, you will find all about it. But PDF, as I said, I think is here to stay and it's not going anywhere, unless, of course, someone comes up with a completely new output format that gains traction. But to do that, they're going to have to make it work with printers, plate makers.
Right.
And at the moment, the only format that a plate maker accepts is a PDF.
Yeah. So that creates a lot of...
Or a full page image.
Yeah. I mean, all of that hardware aspect of the actual production of physical paper obviously creates a lot of, difficulties, with any notion of, like, you can change software, overnight, and that's trivial. But as soon as something becomes a physical piece of hardware, it's, it's a different ball of wax altogether. One of the things that I see happening, which I wouldn't have predicted, is, as you know, all of this AI stuff is everywhere these days. But the format of choice, it seems, for getting structured content into and out of large language models is Markdown.
Yes, but it's missing a lot of things. I mean, it has numbered lists and bulleted lists. It does not have what tech calls description lists.
Right.
What HTML calls DL. It doesn't have that topic and discussion format, which is a major flaw. Probably the biggest stumbling block to people trying to write serious document in Markdown. You can
get the sense.
The Markdown standard says, oh, well, if it's not there, you can just use HTML.
Yeah.
But some of it works. And so, yeah, I mean, there are lots of those, and Markdown is quite good for authoring. If you don't want that kind of list, then, don't bother. If you're writing a novel where the only Markdown is a chapter and a paragraph, and I mean, literally, chapter and a paragraph. Most novels don't even have italics in it.
Yeah. I mean, there's some interesting tooling coming along based around that. Obviously, that you've got the juggernaut of the AIs, and these increasingly impressive, like Gemini, for example, can do a really good job of taking even some quite nasty old, OCR'd PDFs or badly scanned PDFs, and can do a really pretty impressive job of extracting structured content from them. But I'm thinking of tools like, for example, Obsidian is one I've come across, and Zettler. These things that we've started out in life as more these kind of note taking applications, to try and help you, get your thoughts out of your head. And a lot of them have got this kind of markdown type capability built into them. But I do think there's definitely a there in that whole ecosystem. Something I think is going to emerge from that. Some W3C type initiative, I think, to move markdown on, I think is probably likely to happen as a consequence of all of this AI stuff.
That would be very interesting. Yeah, I mean there are several things which need to happen, in my view, and I wrote an entire thesis about what they could do with the interface. Has to be easy, or even easier, for an author to sit down and just write without having to worry about what's underneath, or is the markup right, or why doesn't this work, or in the case of, let's say, Word, and why shouldn't they hit on Word? Everybody else does. You move a footnote from this chapter to another chapter, and all of a sudden the footnote changes size and it's all in italics for no earthly reason apart from, I suspect, incompetence in writing the interface. There is too much going on there. But that's not hit on Word. OpenOffice has had its share of problems doing similar things. I had an academic come into me in a panic because his 12 chapters of Festschrift for a colleague had just disappeared. And I said, what do you mean disappeared? He said, well, I'm writing chapter 1 myself as the editor. And so I wrote chapter 1. He said, then I copied and pasted, and they were all written in OpenOffice, so this was fine. Copied and pasted all the other 12 chapters into the document, and then sent it off, and the publisher said, yeah, that's looking good, and said, you just need to edit the footnotes of your own in chapter 1. And so he said, I did that, and as I edited them, bang, all 12 chapters disappeared. So that immediately set alarm bells ringing. Fortunately, he had the good sense to type Control-Z, get them back, save the file, and then come and see me. But it was clear that what had happened is that he had pasted all 12 chapters into the scope of the footnote. And of course, the big error on OpenOffice's part was that it permitted chapter-level markup inside
footnotes,
which is criminally stupid. But it's part of the way of working, which says, oh, it's only a word processor. You can do anything anywhere.
Yeah.
And so long as it looks right, that means it must be right.
Yeah.
It's absolutely not. It is exactly the opposite.
Yeah.
But fortunately, we got them all back. And I then said, well, look, you would get a far better result because he was struggling to meet the demands of the publisher for the margins and the font and all the rest of it. I said, look, if you have finished editing it, just leave it with me. And I extracted the XML from the OpenOffice and turned that into LaTeX and produced the whole thing as PDF.
Right.
And the publisher was very happy and said, how on earth did you manage to do that? There you go.
Yeah, that's the benefit of being able to crack those things open. We do that to this day quite often.
That reinforced in my mind that what I was doing with my own work for 20, when did HTML stabilize? About 88. I haven't written anything in LaTeX since then.
Okay.
I have only authored in XML or HTML before, and XML now.
And then generated the LaTeX.
Generated LaTeX. So I'm really the worst person in the world to ask about how LaTeX code can be made easier or prettier. I don't care.
Right.
As far as I'm concerned, LaTeX is an API for producing PDFs.
Yeah. Understood.
And all I do is squirt out LaTeX code from my XML and run LaTeX, and out pops a PDF.
Yeah. Indeed.
So it's no. I happen to know XML, so I happen to know LaTeX, so it's easy for me to do this. If you don't know either, then it's very hard.
Sure.
It does mean that the 3 books that I've written and my thesis and all the big documents and pretty much all the small documents, and certainly the articles that I write for journal thing, are all authored in XML.
Right. Very good.
I wouldn't think of using anything else because to me it's now easy, and it means that I can reuse components and I don't have to worry about the word processor I'm using suddenly changing things and making all my previous files obsolete or any of these other silly little games that they play.
Right.
And it goes right way back to articles I wrote back in the late 80s, and I can pick them all up and they all still process. But
They all still work. Yeah.
But it's also something which companies are interested in. You well know the pipeline stuff.
Sure.
Anybody who's in a company maintaining large quantities of documentation, particularly for life or death, like medical or airplane maintenance and this kind of stuff, would be out of their tiny minds to do it any other way.
Yeah.
So the provability, as you said before, the demonstrability, we can stand over this and swear it is what we wrote. And nobody can, well, they can change it if they get access to the files, but you cannot deny the fact that this is the authoritative version.
Indeed, yeah.
Very important, but
Indeed,
a lot of people would prefer to give a copy of Word to their engineers and say, look, use this. Pass the buck on to the engineers, and of course, immediately their productivity goes down because they spend half their life sweating Word, trying to make it do what they want. And the other half, of course, people like me are responsible for. When I teach LaTeX, of course, at some stage, you get to the point where you need to talk about fonts. And by that stage, they have mostly, the students, academics, most of them, have quite happily absorbed the idea that you measure in certain units and you can have bold and you can have italics and you can do this and that. And by and large, once you set the font for the document, everything else falls into place. But, if you want to have your headings done in a different style, you can do this and that, and you've got fonts that you can play around with. And then, of course, they realize that with Duo LaTeX, they can open up anything from their hard disk, any font they care to name, they can open it up and use it. And so the session degenerates into this free-for-all where they're all saying, oh, God, look, I can do this and this. Oh, and doesn't that look pretty better in red? Why don't you try this? And I then have to, at the close of that session, before lunch or before tea or whatever it is, I have to say, look, I'm sorry about this. I have now successfully polluted your brain permanently. From now on, you will never be able to sit in front of the cereal packet at breakfast without proofreading it and saying, oh, look, they use Gotham for this subheading or whatever. Because the moment you're infected by the font virus, you become sensitive to the existence of fonts and you start to notice how other people use them.
Yeah.
And so the next time you open your favorite journal or your newspaper or whatever, or a new book, you look at it and say, oh, gosh, I wonder why they chose that. Oh, God, isn't that ugly?
I kind of hard.
I'm sorry, guys. I have diverted your brains. And I hope you will forgive me. And they'll laugh about it. And I've had half a dozen of them over the years come back to me the next day and said, you know what you said about the breakfast cereal at the packet? And they said, yeah, well, I did. And I caught myself doing it. And I thought, oh, gosh. So, yeah, it's that side of it has always been interesting. But people do. And I mean, you talk to people who write big documents and they will tell you about the length of time they spend fiddling with fonts. And stuff doesn't matter whether it's in tech or anything else. Once people get access to fonts at the lowest level, it's fine in Word. You've got access and you can see the font name and the style and size. But that's it. It doesn't tell you anything about font combinations. And whether they come in families or not. And the moment you start discovering there's a whole history to this, they get interested, which is great. I think quantified it. I mean, we've been through a lot of this together on the same committees and things over the years, and I mean, we've noticed the same things happening. Whether they will continue to happen with the same regularity and frequency, I don't know. I only forecast after the event. There almost certainly will be a change to the output format of this stuff. While you still have access to computers and compilers without the government interfering in them, then I suspect that TeX and LaTeX will still continue to be available.
And I think we what tends to happen, I think, is people, they look at kind of revolutionary times, IT revolutionary times when they come along. I remember, I don't know, object-oriented programming or something. And, old school programming is dead. And, now artificial intelligence and old school programming is dead. And, everything is changing. But in truth, those statements tend to, overshoot the actual mark. That a lot of this stuff, has a longer life than you might think. And just because a whole bunch of stuff is new and shiny doesn't mean it's necessarily going to stand the test of time.
You remember a program called The Last One?
I do not.
This was back in the late 70s, I think. And it was designed to be the last programming language you'll ever need. And it was on the principle of COBOL, that it could be written even by your manager.
Right.
And it was, of course, it died a death within a couple of years. But shortly after that, about 82, I was sent by my American employer from London to the States to look at a couple of companies that we were taking over. One of them was a database company in Boston, whose name I cannot even remember nowadays. But they had an interface to the database system, which was designed to let managers ask questions without having to call in the IT department. So you could type requests such as, show me all the employees in our Midwest region broken down by age and sex. And it would come back with a table. Yeah, I mean, it recognized sufficient of English syntax and the meanings of some words to be able to do an extract from the database and by and large get it right. And I thought that was then, 82, fairly clever. Right. They had taken the trouble, not that it was difficult to do it, but that they had taken the trouble to do it, because they reckoned that this big selling point was allowing managers who typically are not IT people to be able to interface to the corporate database and get sales information, employment information, whatever it is, without having to call upon somebody who writes SQL.
Right.
But again, we ended up not taking over the company for other related reasons, mainly because we actually had a database of our own, which was infinitely superior, called Oliver. It was very good, and I miss it. But that was
There was a thing I remember that I thought was kind of nice when I first came across it. Was a QBE, I think it was called, Query by Example.
Oh yes,
which was it would spit out SQL queries under the hood, but you were essentially kind of filling in the things you knew, and then leaving the rest blank, and it was then inferring from that a kind of an SQL select statement that would find all of the records that basically would fill in the blanks.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing some interesting new startups taking the whole LLM thing to that problem. So I think we're actually, we're closer now than we've ever been, I think, to that day when you can actually, someone, I can't remember his name, recently said that the cool programming language of the 21st century may well be English. Because the fact that you can use natural language talking to LLMs um, does create this interesting possibility. Now, it comes with a caveat, and the caveat is that all of this, agentic AI stuff, and obviously the hallucination problem is real. It's like this kind of Faustian bargain between it's really easy to do, you don't have to be a programmer, but it's not necessarily accurate. Is probably one of the dilemmas we're going to have to deal with here in the next few years. So the benefits are enormous in terms of the community of folks who can now get computers to do clever things.
Yeah.
But with it comes an increased risk of things not necessarily going well.
I mean, the model on which a lot of these things are predicated, although they may not acknowledge it, is science fiction novels like those of Ian Banks. The AI ships minds capable of managing the universe, and of course interfacing with humans and other beings using natural language.
Mm.
But in order to do that, you need to have a set of computers the size of a starship, which makes our puny little attempts with data centers look like a pinprick on the surface of a whale.
Yeah.
And I think acknowledgement of the fact that, yes, we're making some progress. Yes, the computers can sort through the complexities of English language syntax. They don't understand it, but they can pick out a few keywords and try to fake up an understanding. But until they achieve sentience, I don't think there is any way that they are going to be reliable.
Mm-hmm. So where do you stand? Let's finish maybe on that. I'll ask you the $10,000 question then. Do you believe that we will eventually get to the stage of AGI of sentient machines, or not?
Not for another 100 years at least.
For 100 years, okay.
No,
all right.
I think it's our lack of understanding, both of the human brain and of the capacity of computers,
Right.
and the difficulty of dealing with the size of software that will be needed to do this.
To do it, yeah.
Unless somebody comes up with a groundbreaking way of dealing with the size of the software.
Yeah.
I don't see any way in which it can cope with the English language. It would be far easier if they used a different language, which has less ambiguity.
Right. Well, and attempts have been made at creating them.
I'm open to linguists who will attack me for saying, of course they do. English, unfortunately, has a few additional gotchas.
It does indeed. But there have been attempts at creating such things over the years. Something like conlangs, isn't that what they're called? An entire family of constructed languages.
Been Volapük and various other artificial languages designed to stop it. But what have people done with them? They've gone and expanded them and turned them into languages capable of literature as good as any natural language.
Which brings with it all of the exceptions and stuff that we associate with normal languages. Right.
Yeah, except actually, if you want a field for the future, get into exception handling.
Exception handling. Okay, noted. Peter, it's been fantastic talking to you.
It's been great to chat to you. Yeah.
We'll talk again soon. And thank you very much for your time this morning.
It's a pleasure. Thanks very much.
Okay.